Okay, this video is going to show you how the RetroPie setup script works. And although it's called sort of a setup script, it's also got various configuration options to make the system work slightly differently. This version I'm using is RetroPie 3, the final version. It came out 11th of August 2015. And all I've done to this is expand the disk space. So you can see I've got all of my disk space available on the card. Besides that, it's the stock RetroPie 3 final version that I've downloaded from the Pet Rock Block website. So it's the system as a whole rather than installing it separately. And to get to the setup script, which is where a lot of the RetroPie work is involved and has been developed, because obviously it's a collection of various emulators to play the retro games, and the RetroPie project really brings that all together in a nice tight package, and the scripts are quite key to that. So if we change the directory here to RetroPie-setup and press enter there, I'm going to list that directory, and the script we're going to run, the key script here is that one, RetroPie setup script. So to run it, we're going to run that as supervisor, which is sudo, do this as a supervisor, // that just tells the system that we're looking in the current directory, and it's RetroPie_setup.sh, and press enter there. Now when you press enter, if you get a message saying you haven't got much disk space, that's where you really need to expand the disk space, because you might take various steps here. It's going to fill up more disk space, so make sure that's done. You've got various options here. You've got about 6 options, and you can jump between them: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Press U and R, or you can just use the up and down arrows. And like I said, I'm using RetroPie 3 Final, which means this is the version that, or the state that RetroPie was at on the 11th of August. But because it's always ongoing and being developed all the time, there are various changes that happen to this, and you can get the latest version, if you like, of RetroPie by simply updating that script. Now sometimes that script might rely on newer versions of the binaries as well, but by and large, just by updating that script, it shouldn't do any harm, and it will obviously update this to get the latest options. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to run it. Now when I run that, you could argue I've not got RetroPie 3 anymore, I've got a slightly newer version. Today's 22nd of August, so I'll get that version. And so the first thing I'm going to do is update the script. Now for some of these options, or quite a few of these options, you do need an internet connection. Not all of them, but this one for example you do. It goes to the internet to get the latest script. So when you're in here, the first thing to do, update that script, hit enter, and it'll automatically restart the setup script for you. So there you go, it's confirmed it's fetched the latest version, and it'll reload it, and now I've got the latest version. Now here it doesn't look too different, but there are a few menu items behind that have changed, so it's worth doing definitely. Now the first 2 options, 1 and 2, they're about installing RetroPie. Because I've used the image from the Pet Rock Block website, I don't need to install it again. These would be useful if you just had a Raspberry operating system or another application on the SD card and you just wanted to install RetroPie, because if you look at the RetroPie wiki, it describes how to download this setup script, and then you can go to the setup script here, choose binary based installation and install RetroPie. The difference between the binary based installation and source based, besides the fact that source based will take quite a long time, 24 hours plus on a Pi 1, I'm not too sure on a Pi 2, obviously quicker, but not too sure how much quicker, but the binary based would be much quicker. The binary based installation is just where all of the programs are pre-compiled, pre-made if you like, and they effectively just need to be downloaded and copied to the right locations. So it's a quicker process, whereas the source based installation, because it'll take the source code, compile it to make the executable file, it takes a lot longer, but it would be newer because it would be based on the source code, which is often more up to date. But like it says, it's bleeding edge. You really don't need to do the source based installation unless you really want to test the absolute latest, and quite often the absolute latest is not stable, so it's possibly not worth doing. But like I say, if you've downloaded the image from the Pet Rock Block website, you don't need to do either of those, so you've already got everything installed. This is if you're going to install it separately. Step 3, setup. Lots of options in there, and that's where we go into in a second. 4, experimental packages. So these are programs that for whatever reason might be unstable, or they might not have the right maybe they've got missing paths, or for whatever reason they cause problems. So they're put in here to stop lots of issues with the RetroPie system. So going in there, press enter. You can see if I scroll down, it's about 15 or so options. Got Mupen 64 Plus testing, so that's a new N64, a different N64 emulator. MSX emulator. Okay, so these top sets are different, and they've got explanations next to them, obviously. Then you've got a series of LR. LR stands for libretro, so they run within the retroarch front end, and you've got more options there. Now I don't know, these simply might not have been tested, or they might have a particular reason why they're unstable, and that's why they're in here. But if you're really desperate to get a Sega Saturn emulator, you could install it and see how you go with that one. I'm sure at some point they get promoted out of this folder and they get installed to RetroPie standard. So, you know, they won't stay in here for ages. You've got Minecraft Kodi. I tried Kodi the other day, that works fine, but for example, when you install it, the gamepad I've got, the joypad doesn't control it, and also the remote control for the TV doesn't control it, so maybe that's why that's in here still. But besides that, it works fine. So by and large, I think a lot of these would work pretty well. Super Mario War, I know Herb Vargas, who's one of the moderators on the RetroPie forums, has put a lot of work into that, and that's looking pretty good. Yeah, so these ones, you can install them if you want. They're not there by default, but the option's there. And to install it, you just press enter and it will run through and update it. Okay, cancel. Install individual emulators from binary source. Now, if I go in here, you've got a list of all the pre-installed emulators that are on RetroPie. So, for example, if we go down here, we've got LRSCUM. That's one of the Nintendo emulators. Now, for example, actually, there's a good example down here. If I can remember that, it's libretro. There we go. So, on RetroPie 3, the final version, there's a small issue with the emulator, this emulator, the SNES, or one of the SNES libretro emulators. And to fix the issue, you just reinstall the binary. And to do that, you come into this screen, and we can do it now. I want to update this binary because it had problems running certain games. Press enter. Now I've got an option to install it from binary or source. Again, source would be the absolute latest version, but binary is pre-compiled and it's much quicker, and unless you know there's something maybe in the source, the latest version, that you need to get, I'd always go for the binary. So hit binary, and basically that's just going to, well, it's finished. It just goes and grabs the latest version, copies it back down, and it also makes sure the entry is right in the emulator's CFG file. Don't worry about that, you don't need to know about those things, but it just makes a few config files accurate in case they change, and that's done. So now I've not got that problem with the emulator. By and large, you don't ever need to reinstall these, but if you know there's a newer version out there that's fixed a particular problem, you can come in here and reinstall it. I mean, we can pick one at random. This ZX Spectrum one, press enter there, binary again, done. So if I knew there was an issue with the pre-installed one and I needed the latest binary, you just press that, and that's what this section's for, really, to let you quickly and easily update the emulators that are already on the system. It should have a full list of everything that's installed already there. It doesn't take very long for any of these, really. Okay, that was install the individual emulators, which you don't, like I say, you don't need to do unless there's a problem. Perform reboot. That some of the changes here will only take effect when you do reboot, and it's just a convenient option, but you don't typically need to run that. So, in summary, 1 and 2, how to install RetroPie if you don't use the image that you can download from Pet Rock Block. There, if you want to install it on a card that's maybe got other applications already. Experimental packages, just install on the setup. Some emulators that aren't there by default, often for a good reason, but you're welcome to try those. And this one, although it says install individual emulators, it could almost be called update individual emulators, because a lot of them already exist. Or I guess if you're building a system from scratch, you might just want to pick and choose the specific emulators you might only want to emulate. SNES and Mega Drive. So you could go in there and then just choose SNES and Mega Drive emulators and you'd be done. So you'd save a lot of space. So it's that choice as well. Okay, now setup. A lot of options are in here to be used post-install. And that's post-install whether you did it this way or you've used the image. And I pretty much always just use an image. I don't tend to install like this at all ever. Not that it's a bad way of doing it, I just find the image a lot more convenient. So 3, setup. Okay, we've got lots of options here, just get down there. Okay, so this is, like I say, often being updated, which is why we updated the script. Sometimes there's a requirement to, for example, between the RetroPie 3 final release and now, which is about 2 weeks between the two, there's been quite a big update to the PS3 controller section and also Bluetooth devices. So yeah, you just get the latest RetroPie version really this way. Okay, so first option, configure audio settings. By default, I tend to find mine fine. I use HDMI and it works. But you can change that. You can go in here and say automatic detect, which is what I tend to keep it on. Headphones, obviously, if you want to use headphones directly in there. Force HDMI. I have used it before on a couple of TVs, and there's been no sound on HDMI. So I've gone in here, forced HDMI, and then it works. So it can be useful to try that if you've got some sound issues. And then here you've got adjust the volume, although I've never really found that to be an issue, or reset back to default. But yeah, I'd leave that as it is unless you've got some audio problems. Like I say, sometimes HDMI helps override certain settings to sort of force audio out, but should be fine. Okay, next option, auto start emulation station. Emulation station, I'm sure you know, but is the graphical interface to choose which game you want to play. So when you scroll across to see things, the system names like Mega Drive, Super Nintendo, NES, all that sort of thing. And when you start RetroPie, it will automatically boot into emulation station. But if you're doing maybe a lot of configuration work, or there's a good reason why you don't want that to happen, you can just go into this menu and say you'll have original boot behavior. Press enter there, configuration changes to stop automatically starting it. Or if you do want to automatically start and boot straight into there, choose that option. So that's pretty clear. Okay. Next one, bash welcome tweak. That is when you log in and it shows you details like the temperature and the size on your disk, SD card, and your IP address, all that extra information. Maybe you want that trimmed down, you can just go in there and remove the bash welcome tweak, so it's much more abbreviated. I quite like it, so I keep it. But yeah, you've got the options there to choose that. Okay, now configure Bluetooth devices is a really new option. I think it came from a user who's contributed called Death259. I'm sure he's much nicer than his name suggests, but he's offered and produced some extra scripts to easily integrate extra elements to the RetroPie system, and one of those is Bluetooth devices. And the only Bluetooth device I've got is a PlayStation 3 controller, and to do that I tend to use this option down here. But there are a lot of other Bluetooth devices out there, and this could be really useful. Now, I haven't used this before, and I currently don't have a Bluetooth dongle in my Pi, but if I did, I'd press this, and I've got options. I could connect to a device, remove one, and display what's currently there. So that, again, they're pretty self-explanatory. Obviously you want to have a dongle plugged in before you try these, but it should make connecting those devices a lot easier. I think I've got one on order actually, so hopefully in a couple of weeks or so I should have one to be able to test, and I can use a script to try that because it's effectively a generic Bluetooth device, and it would be good to hook that up. But it certainly looks straightforward based on those options to configure that. Okay. Next one, edit RetroPie retroarch configurations. Now there's quite a lot of options within this, and this is to make it easier, I guess, to edit the configuration files that RetroPie uses directly, manually if you like. It's a nicer interface. In a lot of the videos that I've done about how to change settings, I typically sort of drop out to this, get back to the standard screen and use the text editor Nano. But this is perhaps an easier way of doing it. It's got a few benefits over doing it Nano. So if I press edit, now we've got 5 options. It does cover quite a lot here. So again, I should stress, you don't need to touch any of this if you don't want retro. You can just use RetroPie without tweaking any of these settings, and it should be fine. but if you do want to make some changes, this is quite an easy way of doing it. So the first one, change common RetroArch options. Now RetroArch, just a reminder, is the front end to run libretro cores, which is a lot of the emulators. A lot of them are based on libretro. So if I go in here are my options. You can see there's basically the system name like FBA, GBA, GPC, Mega Drive, etc. So you've got the system names, and then the retroarch.cfg. So that file is the one that RetroPie uses to make sure your configuration, or it will process that configuration script. So whatever you put in there, RetroPie will read and apply to the emulation. And a key one that's different here at the top is all retroarch.cfg. Make changes in that one, and it will affect all of the systems by default unless you override it in the system. So for example, if you put in here video smooth is on, then all the systems would have smooth video unless you go into the individual ones here and turn it off. So I think we just got a list here of all of the systems. Yep. Okay, so if we pick first, we have a look at, they'll all be very, very similar, so we just pick a couple. We've got Mega Drive retroarch.cfg. If I hit enter there, I've got some preset configurations that I could put in. Now, it's not on this screen, I'm not going straight into that retroarch.cfg file, but the changes I make here will be written into it. So it's very sort of easy to use on that basis. So you've got a good example here, video smooth. Now also you can notice when I'm moving up and down these options, you've got a bit of a tooltip down the bottom here to give you some information on the option. So video smooth, smoothens picture with bilinear filtering, should be disabled if using pixel shaders. So to enable this, all I'd have to do is press enter. I've got true, false or unset. True, obviously it would say yes, false it would say no, and unset, I should know this, I've forgotten, it probably doesn't change it. Anyway, let's put true, and now you can see it says true there. And it's so when you run Mega Drive games, the graphics would appear smooth. Although at the moment that's default in the main file, so it wouldn't make a difference. If you see what I mean. I'll just cancel out that a sec, and we'll go and look at this first option, all RetroArch. There you go. Yeah, video smooth is true. So all systems will get that anyway, unless if I cancel, go back to Mega Drive, I would put video smooth is false. Now that would override the true element, so the graphics in Mega Drive would appear slightly more jagged than the rest of the systems. But, a lot of these options you wouldn't need to necessarily set. I mean, like I say, it's got the tips at the bottom and how you can use that. So the full screen, I think it would let you. Actually, I can just see what the options are. Edit. Yeah, so I've got to type an option in there. If I escape out of that one, so I can put my value. I think I would put the pixel reference in the X and Y. Let's go back to unset. There we go. Unset probably removes the entry actually. Yeah. Video threaded. Force aspect ratio. So sometimes you might want to not force it to make, for example, you could make that fit your screen then, but that would stretch quite a lot sometimes, so you wouldn't always want to do that. Video scale integer, again, I mean, I'm not going to read out all the tips at the bottom, but basically this is a quick way to change without having to use a manual text editor like Nano to change these values. And you can do that just by pressing enter. And actually that's quite an interesting one, the shader. In all the configuration files, in all the RetroArch files, a shader is specified but it's turned off, so you can just turn them on here. And shaders are where the graphic overlay sort of changes the way the graphics look to make it look a bit more retro quite often. Anyway, that's where we can change all of those different systems. Again, it's only going to affect it if it's a RetroArch based system. So if you're playing something like maybe MAME and not using a libretro MAME core, then it wouldn't make any difference at all. It needs to be the RetroArch based ones. And like I say, you've got the all option there to set the defaults for all the systems. Okay, so that's that section, change common RetroArch options. And no doubt over time, perhaps other commonly edited values would find their way in there to make it easy to change those. Now, the next four are all manually editable. So you can do what you like in these. These will be more flexible rather than just turning it on or off. So again, you probably want to know a bit about what you're doing here, but it makes it a lot easier to make those changes. So second option, manually edit RetroArch configurations. Again, obviously this is just going to apply to the RetroArch systems. We've got a very similar menu to what we had before. We've got the system name and retroarch.cfg. And at the top we've got the all option again, and also you can note down here that you've got the retroarch.cfg.rp-dist file, and that's the file that RetroPie doesn't read that when you run games, but it stores in here. It stores the default for that system. So if you heavily edit your main retroarch.cfg, you can always see what it should be by looking at the default. So that's what that's for. But basically all the retroarch.cfg ones are the ones that read. So if we go to Mega Drive again and hit enter on that one, here I've got the full text of that file, and as it says, settings made here will only override the main global retroarch.cfg if placed above the include line. You've got the include line here. The include is where it pulls in settings for this file, but it works on a set first basis. So if you set it before you read that in, anywhere up here, values will remain for that system or override values subsequently set here. And the good thing about this interface actually is you can use a mouse to click and move the cursor, so it's quick to jump about. Nano doesn't do that. But, yeah, you can just put whatever command you want here. For example, you could put some controller overrides, or you could put video smooth. You could just override and type true there, although that's where in the previous menu it would do it automatically for us, so it's one of the common options. Other options would be change your hotkey here, or what else? Well, there's lots actually. We can, if I go and cancel, press escape there and check out this one, all.retroarch.cfg, this file's massive. You get an indication of where you are with the % there. So these are all the settings that you could put into those individual emulator options. So if you see a particular setting you only want to apply to one system, you could copy it out of here and put it in the other one. But this is the main one. And whilst I'm in this file, you might see a lot of tutorials telling you to set controller settings in this main file. So just escape out of that a sec. It's all.retroarch.cfg, and if you put anything you put in there, it's going to run for all of the systems. So putting controller settings into that file isn't necessarily a great idea unless you know that you're never going to change it and you're never going to use any other controller ever. Otherwise, it just confuses things. So it should really, you need to be careful what you edit in there, because whatever the settings are read in there are going to apply all the time, unless obviously you override it in the per system retroarch.cfg. So it is an important file to keep fairly clean, and only change if you know that it's going to be something that all systems should pay attention to. And besides pressing escape, I don't know, would tab work here? Yeah, tab works, okay. Right. Yeah, so this screen, it will just, let's go back there. This screen will just let you change each of the individual retroarch.cfg files. As I said before, you can deal with this manually using something like Nano, but it's often quite a bit easier to do that here. So cancel out of that, and we've got section 3, manually edit global configs. So not anymore to do with RetroArch, but other files. So go into 3, and these are, you can see, all in the all directory. So the full path would be opt, then RetroPie, then config. So opt/retropie/configs/all, and then you can see these 4 files yourself. And we saw that file a minute ago because it's a RetroArch file. This is the same one, so you can get to it from that menu as well. So just cancel out of that. Emulators.cfg. This I've forgotten. These will appear for every DOSBox game you've got. You'll get a new, because I think that equates to a particular game, but I've completely forgotten about that one, so ignore that. I'll come back to that. RetroArch.cfg, we saw DispanX. Now this is DispanX, or Dispanx, is effectively a way to speak to the Raspberry Pi graphic chip at quite a low level, so it's a different way of displaying graphics, I guess, in summary, and it can result in a more smooth experience on some games. So by default, some are set to this. In fact, you can see here, so if it's a 1 it's set to use it, and if it's a 0 it's set not to use it, and obviously it's letting you tweak those there if you want. I tend to leave it as default, it seems fine. So emulators is only for the non-RetroArch based emulators. RetroArch is the main RetroArch config, obviously, and all RetroArch core options relates to the individual cores. In there we've got various settings, like for example this RetroArch core MUPN64 GFX plugin accuracy low. Actually, this is a better example. So it's saying the video plugin for the graphics plugin should be Rice as opposed to the default. So you can set all of your core settings here, and sometimes, for example, on the NES emulator, there's Nesotopia, and that's got a setting to set the particular palettes that you might want to use. So as it's described, it's the core options. So you can put settings in there quite easily just by adding a new line, typing it in, and hitting OK. It'll save that detail. Okay, there are those 4 settings. And next one is edit non-RetroArch configuration. So this is for emulators that aren't based on RetroArch, aren't using RetroArch, but you still want to configure in a nice sort of almost graphical way. So these emulators aren't RetroArch based, and quite a common popular one is FBA. There is a libretro FBA, but here's the non-libretro FBA, and I can go in there and change my keyboard keys or joystick keys here to be whatever I want. So that could be quite useful. That's what they're for. They're just the settings for non-RetroArch configuration. I'm just going to quit out of that menu a second because I've forgotten. Manually edit non-RetroArch configurations. Right, also it's got the emulators.cfg in each system here, and this is quite useful because if we take NES for example, there, NES emulator CFG, to that, this says which emulator should be run. Now this is exactly the same option. When you run a game, you get a couple of seconds to press X on the keyboard and your menu pops up and says what default emulator do you want, and this is what it would change. So at the moment the default emulator is libretro FCEUMM, which is this one here. So it looks at the default row, finds the name, and then it'll look for the name here, and it can see it there, and it'll run this command. So if I wanted to use Nesotopia instead, by default, I can just use this menu, change this, delete that, type Nesotopia, and say OK, and it saved it. So now when I run NES games, I get Nesotopia. So this is just a quick way to edit those emulators files and change which one. So Game Boy, for example, I've got 2 options there, 2GB Dual and Gambit. That's the default. I could just type that in, and that would be the default. So same principle. And that's what the emulators.cfg is for, really. Okay, so that's that menu. And the last one, manually edit all configurations. And this is basically an amalgamation of all of these top 4. These top 4 menus kind of divide it up quite cleanly so you can see what you're editing. But if you just want to see the whole list, you can go to 5 and you see the lot, everything we covered earlier. Loads of files there. Now, if I go, just a quick look at that Discman X. Yeah, sorry, that's the same as what we looked at. And any other files there? I think we covered them all really in the previous menus, but yeah, it's just a way of editing text files, really. Okay, so that was 304. Now we've got 305. Configure emulators to use Discman STL. Again, this is, I guess, an easy way to set those 0s and 1s. So you can see here you've got some are disabled, some are already enabled. I tend to use the defaults, but if you've got a reason to change them, really easy to do, just press enter and it changes from what it was to what it is now. So Stella is disabled, press enter, Stella is enabled. So it's it'd be worth trying, just run a game with it, run a game without it, see what change it makes. But like I said, I leave defaults there. Okay, next one, 307, install themes for Emulation Station. Now for a long time with RetroPie, the Emulation Station theme is has been the same. I think the name of the theme is Simple. It's got most of the systems there, but you might want a different look and feel for it, and this is an easy way to change that. To do that, you just go into 307, and you can see here the top one, Simple, is already installed, like it says. But if I want to try a different one, maybe Simple Dark, I can install that. I can just press Enter to do it. It goes and downloads it. Again, a lot of these options in the RetroPie setup script will need an internet connection, so try and make it hook up to that there. Once you configured it, obviously you don't need it anymore. You don't need it to play games, you just need it to change some of these options when it downloads extra files. It doesn't take too long to do this, maybe, I don't know, 30 seconds in total to get one of these themes. It just download it, copy it, there we go, so that's installed as well. Now in Emulation Station you can press the start button, go to the UI section, and if you scroll to the bottom you can change the theme. It's as easy as that really. So that's what these are for and what these can be used for. So cancel out of that. GameCon and DB9. Now I don't know a lot about this. I think this relates to the GPIO pins on the Raspberry Pi and using different custom controllers, or rather original controllers, configure it that way. So if you've got a controller that you want to hook up using GPIO pins, you might need those drivers, but that's probably a separate video. Okay, install pair PS3 controller. This is essentially a way of dealing with the Bluetooth connection for PS3. I've got a separate video on this anyway. It goes into a lot more detail, but basically you press enter and you install the PS3 controller, because by default the programs needed to hook it up, the drivers aren't there, so it'll just install them, and it will ask you to make sure your PlayStation 3 controller is connected by USB, and then it'll run a check. It'll say pull the cable out, and you press the PS button and you pair it, and you can always obviously remove it and reinstall if you want. But like I say, a separate video on that, so that's just for PS3 controller configuration. You don't need to do that if it's wired, or at least you didn't used to. I haven't tried that recently. Anyway, cancel. Okay, Raspbian related tools. Raspbian is the operating system, if you like, and if we go in there, we've got upgrade Raspbian packages. So that just, well, as it says, upgrade the packages that are currently installed. You shouldn't need to do that, but the options are there if you need it. Remove unneeded packages will save a bit of space, but it's already fairly trim, the RetroPie sort of distribution, so I wouldn't worry too much unless you really want to get rid of those extra ones. Obviously it's an easy way to do it. Not sure what disable screen blanker is. Maybe it's when the screen dims, I'm not sure. Enable kernel modules. Okay, I think this relates to, I could be wrong, but I think you need to update this when you start using GPIO pins. Not too sure. Ignore it. Yeah. Okay. Right. What else have we got? Reset ownership. Okay, so I haven't had a problem with this, but if you copy ROMs across, and this is the path where ROMs go, there are various ways of doing it, and I suppose there's a chance, depending on how you do it, that you may change the permissions of the ROMs or the folders even, so that the user Pi can't read it, and this will just make sure that the correct user Pi can read all these files. So if you get problems where ROMs don't load, or it says can't open, for example, or anything relating to permissions, you can run that, and it only takes 2 seconds. I can run it now actually, press enter, there it just reapplies the correct permissions to ROMs. So if you get issues there, run that. Configure input devices for RetroArch. Now from RetroPie 3, probably from about beta 3 I think onwards, certainly now anyway, the way that you can configure your wired USB or any, it doesn't have to be wired, any controller to RetroArch, to use on RetroArch, it will automatically happen when you load into Emulation Station, because that will detect whether it knows about your controller or not, and it will also configure your RetroArch controllers there. So technically you shouldn't need to use this menu anymore. What this menu does is specifically configure your controller for RetroArch games, and it will put the file in the right place, set up all the hotkeys for you. If we press enter here, you can see typically what you do is configure your joystick controller for use with the RetroArch, and it will just run through some prompts saying press X, press Y, press this button, and it will just log them all and create the file for you. Again, I've got a separate video on how joysticks and controllers are configured, but that's where you do it. But do remember that you shouldn't need to, because Emulation Station should be doing that for you anyway. for the RetroArch controllers as well. So that's a recent-ish change that's happened. Previously you always had to go in here and run that. Okay. RetroPie configuration menu for emulation station. Now I should remember, I think by default now the RetroPie configuration menu doesn't appear on emulation station by default, so if I press that it would make it appear as a menu item, and that's a quick way to access certain functions like certain areas in this RetroPie script from emulation station. I don't tend to install it because I prefer it not showing there, but you can always run that and you'll get the extra menu in emulation station. Configure the run command launch script. Now the run command launch script does a lot of work really. It points to a lot of, or it runs a lot of checks, processes. It's really important. But at the moment, the only configuration you can do in here, it relates to, I think this is how it deals with the CPU. So if you want to set the CPU to behave in a certain way, excuse me, you can change that here. I leave it alone. I'm not going to change that, but if you just search for CPU governor Raspberry Pi, I'm sure you'll get a lot of detail on each of those, how each of those behave. Okay, right, where do we get to? Samba ROM shares. So by default, if for example you're on Windows computer and you go start run / RetroPie and open it up, you'll get some browsable shares, which is Samba enabled shares, like the ROMs directory for example. And if I choose this Samba ROM shares, I think it might enable a couple of other ones as well, like for example splash screens are now enabled, so you can quickly and easily choose a new splash screen for RetroPie. Or saying that, I don't remember where the setting is in here to change that. Oh, well, there we go. Yeah, so that browsable, it makes the what's another directory in there? It makes the ROMs, obviously BIOS, which is quite important. You can just browse that from Windows, so it's easier, probably easier than using FTP, for example, or I'm sure it's easier than using the USB stick. So it's just a useful way to quickly access directories or common directories on the RetroPie system from Windows, because as I'm sure a lot of you have seen, if you try and browse the SD card on Windows, you can't access those folders. So Samba ROM shares are great if you're networked. Okay, SNES dev driver for the RetroPie GPIO, as it says. If you've got a SNES controller and you're using the GPIO adapter, obviously there's a driver there to make sure it works. Configure splash screen. When you start at the moment, you get the I'll just press enter there to enable custom splash screen on boot. Use default, so that's the official RetroPie logo. None of these will change the emulation station splash screen. That's a separate thing because that's emulation station itself. So that shouldn't really, or it doesn't need to be changed. It's the initial RetroPie logo, and we can choose one. You can browse these from that Samba share. I want to know bullet bill. Okay, so it's updated it. There's not a way to view them from this interface, but you can just browse from that Samba share or use FTP and have a look at what options are there. Disable custom splash screen. That probably just puts it back to the default, I guess. Enable, yeah, and choose. Okay, manually edit. Oh, RetroPie. Sorry, I should have read this before I did the video, probably. Show on splash screen. Okay, yeah. Sorry. So here you can just change this. This is the image that will be loaded on boot. So you can type the path to whatever file you like there. That's just the one I selected on this menu a second ago. But you can type whatever you want. Okay. So yeah, disable custom. Cancel. And then where are we? USB ROM service. By default, I think the USB ROM service is installed. That's when you put your USB stick into the RetroPie system and it will copy the ROMs across for you, put it back into your Windows PC. You can put more ROMs there. Then when you put it back into RetroPie, it will automatically copy the ROMs back for you. So basically, if you're not networked, it's a way that you can get new games on there. And I've got a separate video about that anyway. Configure Wi-Fi, again, that's fairly self-explanatory. I tend to use a cabled version, but that's obviously Wi-Fi is really useful to make it a bit more portable. X-Arcade to joystick, that's just if you've got the X-Arcade joystick and you need the drivers. And Xbox controller, if you use an Xbox controller, then you've got the drivers for that as well if you've got any issues getting that to work. And that is about everything in the RetroPie setup script. Again, if I go cancel there, updating it does get the latest changes from the RetroPie sort of development system, so you're always up to date that way. I tend to wait for the new release, just so sort of you can see where you are and you know you've got certain files, but there's no harm in updating this RetroPie setup script really. You just get to see the latest changes to it, and hopefully that was useful. I know I didn't go into detail into all of the options, but hopefully it should give you an overview of what's possible to configure using this menu system. And as you can see, you don't have to use it, but there are various tweaks it makes very easy to do. If this video is useful, please click the thumbs up, really appreciate that. And if you've got any suggestions for future videos, do put that in the comments. I'm happy to read those, and hopefully, yeah, it's helped you out. Thanks very much.